Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. So here we are for the lesson number 1 of week number 5. In the previous week, in the previous lessons, we have talked about the present tenses, the translation from Urdu language into English language. In this lesson particularly, we are going to talk about the change of voice of present tenses. For that, my dear students, I have set 3 main objectives for the lesson. By the end of this lesson, my students will be able to comprehend the nature of voice, what voice is itself. To figure out the rules of changing the voice of sentences, there are some rules which, if they can apply in the sentences, the game will be easy for my students. And the third main objective of the lesson would be to learn how to change the voice of sentences. That would be our final and ultimate objective of the lesson. My dear students, if we talk about voice itself, voice in terms of tenses, in terms of grammar, is we can term it as importance. There are 2 types of voice, active and passive. In active voice sentences, subject is the voice of sentence, and in passive voice structures, object is the voice of sentence. What do we mean by this? I mean through this that in active voice sentences, subject is the most important part of the sentence, and in passive voice structures, the object remains the most important part of the sentence. So this is what this is what all about voice. 2 types of voice: active voice and passive voice. So there are 2 types. There are 6 actual rules to change the voice of active, change voice of sentences from active to passive voice. My dear students, if we talk about the first rule is to identify the subject and object. This would be our first duty to change the active into passive structure. So this is a sentence, this is active structure: he likes painting. So he and likes, this is our first step. He and painting, we have identified he and painting. So this is our subject and painting is our object. And the second step would be to change the positions of subject and object. You have to bring object into the position of subject and subject into the position of object. So paintings takes the position of subject and he takes the position of object. And the third main and most important part and most important step to change the voice is to identify the tenses. This is the most important thing. If you cannot identify the tense used in active structure, you cannot change them into passive structures. Why? Because every tense has its own passive structures, having its own passive rules to change. My dear students, the first and the foremost duty is, and the most important duty is, to identify the tense. So he likes painting. There is S over here, so it predicts that this is present indefinite tense. So since this is present indefinite tense, we can have a particular rules to change it into passive voice structure. So this is our third step. Put suitable auxiliaries. Every tense has its own helping verbs, has its own helping verbs, auxiliaries. My dear students, I will talk about it, the suitable auxiliaries of every tense later on. Always use third form of the verb in passive structures. So in passive structures, there would always be third form of the verb, and put by preposition before doer of an action in passive structures. So he is the one who likes painting. So if we talk about its passive structure, it takes the position of object, but he remains the doer of an action. He is the one who likes painting. But in passive structure, since object takes the position of subject, we have to tell who is the doer of an action. So by putting by before the subject, we can say this is the one, him is the one who is liking the painting. So this is what the 6 rules of changing the voice. The first one is to identify subject and object. The second one would be to change the positions of subject and object. Third one is to identify the tense. This is the most important. Put suitable auxiliaries. Always use third form of the verb in passive voice, and put by preposition before doer of an action in passive structure. So these are the 6 rules to change the active into passive. My dear students, by applying all these rules to change the active into passive voice, we can talk about present indefinite tense. My dear students, Ali needs my help. This is a sentence of present indefinite tense. Ali needs my help. Now, Ali is your subject and my help is your object. You have to drag this my help as your subject, my help, and Ali will take the position of object, so it will become by Ali. So change the positions of subject and object, we have done it, and then the identification of tense. My dear students, unless you do not recognize the type of tense in use in the sentence Ali needs my help, you cannot change it into passive structures, because every sentence every tense has its own way of changing the voice. In present indefinite tense, my dear students, we use s or es with the singular subject. In declarative sentence, if the subject is plural, we do not use s or es, but the main verb would remain the first form. But in other types of sentences in present indefinite tense, we have helping verbs as do and does. But in passive structures, it changes. Now what it changes, in passive structures we have is, are, and am as helping verbs. Now Ali needs my help is. Always use third form of the verb. My help is need. So third form is need, is needed. My help is needed by Ali. So this is it. She does not call his sons. His sons are not called by her. It is unnecessary use of the over here. We should not use over here as well. His sons are not called by her. So she takes the position of object and his son takes the position of subject, and then according to the subject we use are, not, and third form the verb, and by preposition before doer of an action. Do they purchase a flat? Now the case is similar. If the sentence differs, I mean this is interrogative sentence, do they purchase a flat, we have to follow all these 6 steps. Now they is our subject and our flat is our object. So our flat and they becomes our object. It would go at the end of the sentence them, and then identification of tense by seeing this word do, we can say this is present indefinite tense. Do, instead of do we have to use is rm. So our flat is singular, so we have to use is a flat, and then put suitable auxiliary. We have use, instead of do we use is are, and according to the flat. Always use third from the verb. In place of purchase we have used purchase. So is a flat purchased, and then put by preposition before doer of an action by them. One thing is to notice over here that in passive structures, words, if we talk about the helping verbs, they do not change their positions, they would remain at their positions. As do in interrogative sentence occurs at the initial position of sentence, is the first word of the sentence. Similar is the case of passive structure as well. When we change it into passive structure, is would remain the first word as do in the active structure. So we should not use is in between the sentence. A flat is purchased by them, it would make it as interrogative sentence. We have to change it into interrogative sentence and then passive voice. So this is what we need to do. So we should not change the position of do and does or any other helping verb when we are changing it into passive structure. Why do people spread false news? People is our subject, false news is our object. So false news, and then people went at the last position or the end position of sentence, and then we have to use the suitable identification of tense, obviously. So by looking at this word do, we can say that this is present indefinite tense, and then put by preposition before doer of an action, by people, and always use third form of the verb in passive structure. So spread would remain spread. The third form of spread is spread. So now what we need to do with this why and do. Why would remain same in passive structure, and instead of do we have to use is, am, are. So we have used is because a single subject. So this is all about present indefinite tense. My dear students, in present continuous tense, as you all know that we have is, are, am as our helping verb and plus ing form. For example, Amina is reading an interesting novel. So this is our active structure of present continuous tense. You may be confused with the previous slide. We have used third form of the verb with is, am, are. So now how can you recognize, is this the passive structure of present indefinite tense or active structure of present continuous tense? You need to notice one thing. If is, am, are having ing form, they would be the active structure of present continuous tense. But if they are having third form of the verb, you have to recognize them as the passive structure of present continuous tense. So Amina is reading an interesting novel. Amina is our subject and interesting novel is our object. So Amina would take the position of subject, and interesting novel would take the position of subject. So an interesting novel by Amina. So this is what we need to do till now. And then identification of tense. So is reading is telling you that this is present in continuous tense. Put suitable auxiliaries. My dear students, in present continuous tense, is remain is, are remain are, am remain am. To get rid of this ing form, we add a word with is, am, are. Instead of is in passive structure, we use is being. Instead of are, we use are being, and instead of am, we use am being. So when we put this being, we got rid of this ing form. Now when we got rid of this ing form, we can use the third form of this read. So it would become an interesting novel is being read by Amina. So this is the answer or the passive structure of this active structure. The farmers are not harvesting the crops. Now the crops is our object and the farmers are our object. So the crops are and then not harvested by the farmers. I hope it is clear. There must be a word over here. The crops are not being. I have missed this word over here. So to get rid of this ing form, we have to use over here being. So my dear student, you have to write over here being. The crops are not being harvested by the farmers. Am I sharing memories? So our memories being shared by me. What you need to do is with am, with is, with are, we use third form ing form, but in passive structure we have to use third form of the verb with are, and because of the being we have used shared third form of the verb. So this is our subject and this is our object. So object takes the position of subject. Our memories being shared by me. Hope it is clear to you. How is she playing tennis? So she is our subject and tennis is our object. So tennis, her, by her. And then identification of tense, this is ing form. So is, are, am over here as well. So this is present indefinite tense, and then put suitable auxiliaries. So instead of is, am, are, we use is being, are being, and am being. So tennis is our singular subject. So is tennis, and then we have to get rid of this ing form, we use being. So is tennis being, and then third from the verb with passive structures. So played, and then we have to use by preposition before doer of an action. So this would become is tennis being played by her. Now what we would do with this, how would remain its would remain at its position. So how how in passive structure as well. So how is tennis being played by her? So by following all 6 rules, we can easily transfer active structures into passive structures. If we talk about present perfect tense, my dear students, one thing we have to do differently. In present perfect tense, we use helping verb as has or have, but in passive voice, what we need to do is we have to use has been instead of has and have been instead of have. All the 6 rules would remain the same. Subject and identification of subject and object, change the positions of subject and object, identification of tenses, put suitable auxiliaries, and then these all 6 steps you need to follow by changing the voice of present perfect tense from active into passive structure. So I have written a story has been written by me. I hope there is no need to explain it further. So instead of has, you have to use has been, and instead of have, you have to use have been. All the 6 steps you have to follow with similar following. You have to follow all these 6 steps with this suitable auxiliaries. And now some important notes. This is important since I have realized you have many more questions. You may have confusion in changing the voice. My dear students, there's one exceptional case. There's a sentence. Always an examiner tests you through this. She calls me for help. Now you are looking at the sentence, she calls me for help. There are 2 objects, me and for help. Now many students will take this as their object and they will drag this at the initial position of the sentence. But my dear students, what you exactly need to do is always cater immediate object after the verb. If the sentence has 2 subjects, you have to cater the first right after the verb. She calls me. Calls is your verb and me is your object. This is not your object. So right after the verb, there is your object. So it would become your subject. So I am called by her, and there must be her over here as well. I am called by her for help. So this is the passive structure of she calls me for help. So what you have learned over here, always cater immediate object after the verb. And there is another important note. There is no passive voice of intransitive verbs. I am running in the garden, so there is no passive voice of intransitive verbs. What are intransitive verbs? Intransitive verbs are verbs which do not need objects to fulfill their meanings. For example, I'm running, the meaning is complete, so you should not change it into passive structure. And then, my dear students, at the end of this lesson, I will recap all the 6 steps. What you need to do is to follow all 6 steps of changing of voice. You need to identify the subject and object. This would be your first step. Then you should change the positions of subject and object, and then you have to identify the tense, and then you have to put suitable auxiliaries, and then use always third from the verb in passive structures and by preposition before doer of an action. My dear students, if I can sum up this lesson, what would be the 2 most important things? The first would be to identify the tense and then put suitable auxiliaries. If you can learn these by watching the video 2 or 3 times or 1 time, it would be a great success for you. So tense identification is the most important point because all other 4 are very easy to learn. So my dear students, these 2 are typical, and you can say these are difficult or tricky somehow. So tense identification, this would be your first main and first most important thing if you can learn, and then put suitable auxiliaries, suitable helping verbs. I hope everything is clear to you. I'm going to attach certain sentences in your assignment. You have to change them into passive structures. If you have more questions, I would request you to watch, rewatch the video since you have access to the video. My dear students, Allah Hafiz.